Title: The Pastor's Wrath, a Betrayal Turned Deadly. He was in bed with his wife when she moaned. But not his name, not a stranger's. She moaned his father's name, not by mistake, not in passing. She said it clearly, lost in pleasure. For a moment, Pastor Nathaniel Caldwell froze. His heart stopped. His body went numb. Then rage took over. By the time it was over, his wife's lifeless body lay on a pool of blood. Her screams were silenced, her insides spilled in a brutal act of vengeance. The walls dripped crimson, and the man who had spent his life preaching love and virtue was now drowning in the very sin he had condemned. How does a man devoted to faith become the embodiment of wrath? What happens when betrayal doesn't come from an enemy, but from the ones you trust the most? When the woman he vowed to cherish moans the name of his own father, what's left to hold on to except rage? Before we unravel this chilling case, like this video and subscribe to Crime Chronicles, where love, faith, and betrayal turn deadly.
Pastor Nathaniel Caldwell, charismatic, sharp, and full of conviction, built a following that hung on to his every word. When he preached about faith, people listened. When he spoke about marriage, couples took notes. And when he condemned sin, no one dared to question him. He wasn't just leading a church, he was shaping lives. Young men in the congregation looked up to him, seeking guidance on how to be strong, faithful husbands. Women admired the way he adored his wife, a love they believed was blessed by God. But for all his wisdom and authority, there was one demon he could never shake: his father, Ezekiel Caldwell Sr. Ezekiel was once a preacher too, but where Nate was respected, his father was whispered about in hushed tones. There were rumors, scandals, and dark stories about the old man, affairs, financial fraud, and a trail of women left broken in his wake. Nate spent his whole life trying to be the opposite of him, to prove he was nothing like the man who raised him. He built his marriage on trust, on faith, on everything his father never was. And Tanisha? She was the perfect wife, or at least, that's what everyone believed. She had grace, charm, and an undeniable presence. People in the church admired how devoted she was to her husband, how she always stood by his side, smiling, nodding, playing the role of the ideal, God-fearing woman. But behind that polished image, she was holding on to a secret so big it could burn their perfect little world to the ground. Their marriage was a spectacle. The church adored them. Their social media was flooded with carefully curated photos, smiling in front of the altar, feeding the homeless, celebrating anniversaries with heartfelt captions about God's perfect plan. But pictures lie, because when the doors closed, when the cameras were off, when no one was watching, Tanisha wasn't thinking about her husband. She was thinking about his father. Ezekiel Caldwell Sr. used to be a man of power, a minister who commanded respect, until the whispers started. The rumors about his hands wandering where they shouldn't, about church money disappearing, about women who left the congregation in tears and silence. One by one, the stories stacked up until the only thing left of his reputation was a ghost of what once was. By the time Nate took over the pulpit, he had cut ties completely, determined to build a legacy that wasn't tainted by his father's sins. He wanted to be the man Ezekiel never was, a leader worthy of his congregation's trust. And most of all, he wanted to have a marriage that was built on faith, not lies. But while he was focused on being the good son, the good husband, the good pastor, Ezekiel was waiting in the shadows. It started with stolen glances, then late-night conversations, then secrets whispered in the dark. Tanisha and Ezekiel carried on their forbidden affair for over a year, sneaking around behind Nathaniel's back, behind God's back, behind the backs of an entire congregation that believed their love was pure. But this was more than infidelity. It was a generational curse repeating itself, the same cycle of lies, of lust, of power. The same destruction Ezekiel had left in his wake before, only this time, he wasn't ruining just any marriage. He was ruining his own sons. The question no one could answer was, did Tanisha actually love him? Or was Ezekiel manipulating her the way he had manipulated women his whole life? Was she another victim, or did she know exactly what she was doing? Nathaniel wasn't stupid. He knew something was off. Tanisha had started acting distant, cold, distracted, like she wasn't even in the same room when they were together. The way she pulled away from him, the way she suddenly had excuses for everything. Then there were the whispers in the church, the looks people gave him when they thought he wasn't watching. Maybe someone tried to warn him. Maybe someone even knew. But it didn't matter, because by the time the truth finally reached him, it wasn't through a rumor, a text message, or a confession. It was through the sound of his wife moaning his father's name while he was inside her. It's unclear exactly when or how the affair between Ezekiel Caldwell Sr. and Tanisha Caldwell began, but according to Ezekiel's own confession, it had been going on for over a year before it all came crashing down. By Ezekiel's account, it started as something innocent, a conversation here, a lingering look there. Tanisha had always respected him, even when his son wanted nothing to do with him. Maybe she saw something in the older man that Nathaniel never could. Maybe she felt sympathy for him, for the way the church had cast him aside. Or maybe, as Ezekiel seemed to suggest, she was the one who made the first move. According to his confession, Tanisha sought him out, reaching out in moments when she felt lonely or overwhelmed by the pressures of being a pastor's wife. She confided in him, telling him things she didn't tell Nathaniel, her doubts, her frustrations, her struggles with being the perfect woman in the eyes of the congregation. She needed someone who really saw her, Ezekiel reportedly told investigators. I gave her that. But others suspect his version of events was far from the full truth. Ezekiel Caldwell Sr. was a master manipulator, a man who had spent years using his influence to seduce and control. His past was filled with allegations of inappropriate relationships, though none ever led to formal charges. Some believe he groomed Tanisha, drawing her in, exploiting the cracks in her marriage until she became just another name on his long list of sins. What we do know is that the affair escalated quickly. They arranged secret meetings, sneaking off together while Nathaniel was occupied with church duties. There were late-night calls, text messages deleted before they could be discovered, hurried encounters in places where they thought no one would ever see them. They weren't just having an affair, they were playing with fire in the most reckless way possible. But the most damning part of Ezekiel's confession? He claimed Tanisha was in love with him. She told me she had never felt that kind of passion before, he allegedly said. Not with my son, not with anyone. Was he lying? Was he twisting the truth to make himself look like the victim instead of the predator? Or was Tanisha truly more than just a pawn in his sick game? The only person who could answer that for sure was dead. It was supposed to be a quiet night. February 9th, 2023. A Wednesday, a night like any other in the Caldwell home. No signs of trouble, no warning. Just a husband and wife behind closed doors, like they had been countless times before. But something changed that night, something snapped. According to emergency dispatch records, a 911 call was made from Nathaniel Caldwell's phone at exactly 2:37 a.m. The call lasted only 6 seconds before disconnecting. No words were spoken, just labored breathing, a sound almost like weeping, and what one dispatcher later described as a low, eerie whisper. When officers arrived at the scene 6 minutes later, the front door was unlocked, the house silent, and what they found in the bedroom was a scene straight out of hell. What we know about what happened in that room comes from forensic evidence, autopsy reports, and one final confession from Nathaniel Caldwell himself. The details are brutal, horrifying, and still leave more questions than answers. Based on crime scene analysis, investigators believe the night started out normally. Nathaniel and Tanisha were in bed together, engaged in an intimate moment. But then something happened. A name slipped from Tanisha's lips, not her husband's, not in prayer, but a moan, barely above a whisper. A name that shattered everything. Ezekiel. It was like a match dropped into gasoline. Nathaniel stopped, froze, and then it happened. A realization so violent, so unbearable, it drove him to the edge of his sanity. What happened next can only be pieced together by the blood-soaked walls, the scattered furniture, and the defensive wounds on Tanisha's body. The fight started in the bed. Maybe Nathaniel screamed. Maybe he asked why. Maybe she tried to explain. But it was too late. He lunged at her. She fought back. That much is clear. Neighbors would later tell police they heard muffled yelling, a thud against the wall, and then suddenly a scream so chilling it made the hair on their arms stand up. Then the breaking of glass. A mirror shattered. A piece of it ripped from the floor, turned into a weapon. And in that moment, Nathaniel stopped being a husband, a preacher, a man of faith. He became something else. The coroner's report states that Tanisha was alive when her abdomen was cut open. She fought until her last breath, her fingers clutching at the deep wounds across her stomach, as if trying to hold herself together. Her body was found splayed across the bed, her blood soaking the sheets, her eyes still open, frozen in a stare of sheer terror. And Nathaniel? When officers entered the room, he was sitting at the edge of the bed, his hands coated in red, his Bible clutched so tightly to his chest that his knuckles had gone white. He was rocking slightly, murmuring the same phrase over and over again. She knew what she was doing. Authorities say he didn't resist arrest. He didn't cry, didn't plead, didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply sat there as the handcuffs were fastened, as if he had already accepted his fate. But one question still lingers. Why did he call 911? Was it guilt? A moment of clarity after the storm of rage? Or was it something else? A desperate attempt at redemption? A final confession, not to the police, but to God himself? We may never know. But what we do know is this. A marriage that was meant to be sacred ended in one of the most brutal, shocking crimes this town has ever seen. Nathaniel Caldwell was arrested without resistance. Officers found him sitting at the edge of the bed, drenched in blood, his wife's lifeless body sprawled beside him. He didn't cry, didn't ask questions, didn't plead for mercy. When they pulled him to his feet and read him his rights, he only said one thing. She knew what she was doing. It wasn't a plea of innocence. It wasn't an apology. It was a statement, cold and final. But what did it mean? Was it a confession, a justification, or something even darker? The words of a man who believed, without hesitation, that his actions were righteous. As Nathaniel sat in a cold interrogation room, refusing to say anything else, one man was nowhere to be found. Ezekiel Caldwell Sr. From the moment the news broke, Ezekiel disappeared. He was nowhere near the crime scene, nowhere near the church, and when investigators tried to reach him, his phone was already disconnected. Why did he run? Some say he was terrified, that he knew his affair had cost a woman her life and didn't want to face the consequences. Others believe he was never afraid at all, that he set this entire tragedy in motion, manipulated every move, and now he was simply watching the destruction from a safe distance. Maybe in his mind, this was how it was always supposed to end. Meanwhile, the community was torn apart. The church that once held Nathaniel as their moral compass was now divided. Some couldn't believe it. They wept for him, prayed for him, convinced that the devil himself had driven him to this moment. Others weren't so forgiving. They saw him for what he was now, a murderer, a man who let rage consume him instead of practicing the forgiveness he preached. And then there were those who blamed Tanisha. She shouldn't have been with that man. She knew what she was doing. She was playing with fire. Online, the debate exploded. Was Nathaniel a victim of betrayal, driven to madness? Or was he a wolf in sheep's clothing, a hypocrite who hid his violence behind the cross? One thing was clear. The perfect marriage they had once sold to the WEO Nathaniel Caldwell's trial was one of the most polarizing courtroom battles in recent history. The case wasn't just about a murder, it was about betrayal, morality, and how far a man could be pushed before he snapped. The prosecution painted a chilling picture. This wasn't just a crime of passion, they argued. This was something deeper, something darker. The brutality of Tanisha's murder, the sheer rage in every wound, showed that this wasn't just a momentary lapse in control. It was an execution. They laid out damning evidence, months of secret text messages between Tanisha and Ezekiel, records of late-night meetings, and witness testimonies from those who had suspected something long before Nathaniel ever knew. The prosecution didn't just want a conviction. They wanted the jury to see Nathaniel as what they believed he truly was, a man who thought he was above judgment until he finally unraveled. But the defense had its own story to tell. Nathaniel wasn't a cold-blooded killer, they argued. He was a broken man, a victim just as much as his wife was. He had spent his whole life fighting to be different from his father, only to be betrayed in the worst way imaginable. His wife, the woman he trusted above all else, had been sneaking around with the one man he despised most. How could anyone stay sane after discovering that? The defense pushed the idea of temporary insanity, that years of suppressed anger, humiliation, and resentment toward his father exploded all at once that night. Nathaniel wasn't a monster, they claimed. He was a man who had been pushed too far. But was that enough? The jury was left with a choice. Was Nathaniel a man broken beyond repair, pushed into an unspeakable act? Or was he a killer who had been hiding behind the cloth, waiting for his moment to finally lose control? The verdict would determine more than just his fate. It would spark national conversations about morality, marriage, betrayal, and the fine line between victim and villain in relationships built on lies. This case isn't just about a murder. It's about the generational consequences of lies, deception, and unchecked desire. Nathaniel Caldwell spent his life preaching virtue, condemning sin, yet in the end he became the very thing he warned others about. He wasn't just a man of God, he was a man drowning in rage, betrayal, and blood. Tanisha sought love, passion, maybe even something she felt was missing in her marriage, but she paid the ultimate price for crossing a line that could never be undone. Whether she was a victim of manipulation or an equal player in the deception, we'll never truly know. And then there's Ezekiel Caldwell Sr., the man at the center of it all. A father, a former preacher, a disgraced leader whose sins never really left him. Maybe in the end the greatest sin of all was his, not just for what he did, but for what he set into motion. Was Nathaniel a victim of his father's wicked legacy, trapped in a cycle he could never escape? Or was this darkness always inside him, waiting for the perfect moment to be unleashed? And the biggest question of all,